All right, good morning and welcome to the webinar. My name is David Simpson. You've got my email address on the board. You can use that to ask questions or provide feedback during or after the webinar, and I try to respond to everything that comes in. So don't feel shy about using that at all. You can also follow us on Twitter. There's the my company's Twitter account there at the bottom, and on another slide we'll have both that one and my personal one. The topic today is access path stability on Db2 for ZOS, which is an interesting topic. This presentation's been given a couple of times now at different user groups, and people have really enjoyed it, so we decided to put it together in a webinar format and make it available for a wider audience. So when we talk about access path stability, we're really looking at the stability of performance over time, right? So that when you write queries and put them into applications, and you perhaps even up front do a little bit of tuning to make sure it's going to perform well, or when you're happy with the performance of a particular application and the Db2 calls that are inside of it, that we can preserve that happiness over time, right? So that we are trying to decrease the volatility with regard to performance. So that's the topic for today. We're going to focus on the features that came in versions 9, 10, and 11 of Db2 for ZOS. There's more delivered in version 12, and most of that deals with the same type of stability for dynamic SQL. Today we're going to focus on the static SQL stuff, and perhaps we'll come back and review the dynamic features in a future webinar. All right, so before we get started, just a couple of things. If the word from our sponsor, if you will. My company is Themis Education. We do training on a variety of topics, either at your place or in the public venue. A lot of what we do now is virtual training, especially for public classes. And you can see our full kind of list of courses and everything at our website. So this training is actually, this webinar is actually just a little slice of some material that's actually in a couple of our classes related to Db2 ZOS. So if you like what you see and you'd like some more, please take a look at our website. www.themisinc.com, THEMISINC.com. For a copy of today's webinar, you can go to our website, either themisinc.com/webinars, or if you just go to the main website, which looks something like this. Up toward the top is a tab that says webinars. Right, so our course schedules and description of the courses we have is up there as well. But if you click on the webinars tab, you'll see today's webinar is right at the top. For right now, there's a button there that says get the slides. So if you'd like to follow along, you can download the PDF copy of the slides. But you'll also see you can sign up for upcoming webinars there, and you can replay past webinars. So we've been doing about one of these a month for about the past 3 years. So there's a pretty decent catalog of old webinars out there. A lot of them are Db2 related. Some of them are not. You can search them or just kind of scroll through the list and see what's interesting to you. So if you'd like the slides, probably the most important part of that right now is if you'd like to go get the slides, again, go to the website, themisinc.com/webinars. And today's webinar right now is right at the top. after we're done here, it'll probably fall into that past webinars list, but you'll still be able to get the slides a little bit later by visiting there as well. The replay will be out there in the next couple of days if you'd like to come back and look at it again or share it with friends. So that's a little bit about us. This is a little bit about me. I think many of you have seen me before. If you look at that webinar history, you'll see a little bit of me out there. I've been doing this training consulting thing for about the last 11 years now. But before that, I was a real DB2 developer and a real DB2 DBA for several years each at a couple of large-ish DB2 shops. So I've also been for the last 12 or 13 years, a pretty frequent speaker at user groups, in particular iDoug. And so you can read more about me in your spare time if you'd like. This slide is in the deck. So, oh, and the Twitter stuff down there, you got my email address. You can see our company's website. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at ThemisDave, or the company at Themis Training, and you'll get more announcements about webinars like this and things going forward. So what we're going to talk about today is access path stability. So we're going to a little bit of history lesson. This is a set of features that was delivered really well over the course of 4 different releases of DB2 now. And again, we're going to talk about the first 3. So versions 9, 10, and 11. This stuff really started in version 9 and has been enhanced in every release since. So we're going to talk about, what was delivered at each time and, what the right way or some best practices, I guess, about how this stuff can be used. So plan management, comparing access paths, reusing access paths, and we're going to look at a little bit of output of binds that will show us, what this stuff looks like, and again, talk about what I think are some good ways to implement this stuff. So again, don't want to dwell on the history. We don't need to memorize times, dates, and DB2 releases, but it's kind of helpful to understand how this stuff evolved as we get into the details. So all the way back in DB2 version 9, which came out in about 2007, so it's about 10 years old now. The first piece of what we now call the collection of access path stability features was delivered, and that came in the form of a feature called plan management. This actually was delivered back at the time, not with the general availability release of DB2.9, but in the maintenance stream, which actually had some consequences at the time for what we could do with it. Plan management came to us as a parameter on the REBIND. So the idea was that when I did a REBIND, I could preserve the way things were today. So we're going to talk about bind versus rebind here in just a minute. But this stuff was only for rebind and still is. And it's all about preserving the way things used to be, so that if I don't like the way things have changed performance-wise, that we can go back. All right, so we had the plan management keyword and then that switch previous or switch original. Again, the idea being maybe we migrate to a new release of DB2, or we run a new run stats, get more complete statistics. We're going to rebind the applications because we want the new stuff to be considered. But just like always, we're a little bit afraid that some things might get worse rather than better. So we do a rebind. We say perhaps plan management extended. We'll talk about the different values in just a minute. And if things get better, then we're all happy, right? If things get worse for performance, then we could do a rebind switch previous, meaning go back to the way things used to be. Now, we're not talking about application functionality here. We're talking about performance, right? Just strictly performance. All right, and so the catalog didn't really change much. That actually was a consequence of this thing being delivered in the maintenance stream. So syspackage always has the current copy of the package. We're going to talk about the the shell game that we're going to end up playing here with these different copies of the package in just a minute. All right, so that was the first step. Just allow me to keep old copies of the package when I do a rebind, so that if I rebind something and performance gets worse, I can go back to the way things used to be. That was the idea of plan management. Db2 came along and added some additional bind options. Okay, and the two big ones that came here called APCOMPARE and APReuse. We also got catalog support for the stuff that came in version 9. Right, so one of the problems of plan management DB2 9 was that I have all these extra copies of the package, but I couldn't really see any of them. And I could only see the current one in the catalog. So we got a new catalog table in version 10 called syspackcopy. If you look out there, you'll see all these inactive copies of packages, that are not currently being used, but are available in case you want to go back to them. We also got a bind parameter called APRetaineDupe. We'll talk about that one in a little bit. Support for all of this was extended to native SQL stored procedures, which was not there originally. And we got some pretty cool stuff down here at the bottom: explain package and bind or rebind with explain only. We're going to talk about that as well. So this is more ability to allow you to see into a package that already exists in both what access paths were chosen when it was bound, even if that was a long time ago, or what would the access paths be today if I were to bind it again without actually doing that bind. Okay, so lots of neat stuff came in version 10. We'll talk about the version 11 stuff in just a minute. Really kind of minor enhancements to some of the stuff from version 10. Before we do that, though, we really need to talk about bind versus rebind. And I just went straight to quote chapter and verse here out of the command reference. So this is something I find is often confusing to people. When I do a bind, what that means is, if we're talking about COBOL code here, which is very often, or stored procedures, right? These are the things that we end up doing binds for. When I change the code and compile it, I'm doing a bind. All right, a bind is taking SQL statements that may or may not have changed in the code and figuring out how to do them and producing a package. A rebind is taking a package that has not changed, meaning the code hasn't changed, the consistency token hasn't changed, and I'm just asking DB2 to rethink everything even though the code has not changed. So this is where our terminology gets a little confusing. If I recompile the program, I'm going to do a bind, not a rebind, right? If I recompile the program, that means the code could have changed. Even if the SQL didn't change, I still am going to need to do a bind, because the one thing we know that has changed is the consistency token, right? Which is what prevents you from getting negative 805s, right? You want to keep that lined up with what's in the program you're running. So I bind when I've changed the code, right? Or if I've compiled the code. I rebind. Well, there's a bunch of situations I might rebind in. None of them have anything to do with the code being updated, right? I'll do a rebind perhaps when we go to a new release of DB2. And the optimizer has gotten some improvements, right? The structure of a package in memory has changed, so a rebind is helpful for performance, right? So that the package was bound on the same release as we're currently running in DB2. Okay, so that's one reason for a rebind. Perhaps the DBA has run stats, right? So our tables used to be small and then they got big, or something about the nature of the data has changed in a significant way. So we run stats, and we want DB2 to take those new statistics into account for access path selection, so we do a rebind. Okay, code didn't change, but the environment changed somehow. Occasionally, we'll do a rebind because we had to drop a table or an index or something and put it back, and the actual underlying package has been marked invalid by DB2. Right, that will require a rebind in order to make it executable again. Okay, but it is kind of important to keep these two things straight, especially when we're talking about stability, because some of the stability features only apply to rebind and some of them apply to both. So when we talk about that, it's kind of important to keep in mind what's going on. We also should make at least a passing reference to package versioning, which we're not really going to address here in detail. This is something that's existed for a long time in DB2. But when I prepare a program for execution, so this is kind of assuming this is a COBOL-like program, right? Your source code goes into a precompiler. The precompiler splits your code up into COBOL and not COBOL, right? The COBOL gets compiled into a load module on the left side of our little diagram there. And the DBRM, database request module, which is really just your SQL that's been stripped out of the program, goes through a bind. If we ask for package versioning, we do that actually in the precompile. And package versioning is all about it's helping our change control process, right? So if I change the code and compile it again, I might produce a new version of the package that has modified SQL in it, right? So the idea being, I can stage code in production before I actually am ready to cut over to it. Fallback versioning helps for fallback, right? If and I know this never happens at any of the places represented here, but I've heard sometimes, we put code into production and it doesn't go well, and somebody, some important person says, fallback, right? Let's make things back to the way they were yesterday. If we've done package versioning, then all we got to do is throw the old load modules back out there, the old versions of the package are still there. Okay, so package versioning is something you may or may not be doing, and it is unrelated to the things that I'm going to talk about. So, well, not unrelated, but I guess distinct from. So, for example, we have program 1 version 1 on the left. We do a bind. We get a package for that program with a version of v1. If we take in, if we recompile the program, it produces a new DBRM, which now has version 2 in it, and I bind that thing. I now have 2 copies of that package in the same environment with different versions, and the one that gets executed at runtime will be determined by what load module we run. All right. Here's the deal. When we start talking about plan management, what this means is we're going to have each version of a package can now have multiple copies. And I try and catch myself when I'm talking about this because I'm so tempted to always refer to what we should be calling a copy as a version, because a version is something different. Right? Each package could have multiple versions. Each version could have multiple copies now. So what the heck does that mean? Keep in mind, just versioning is a change control thing, right? Different versions of the code out there at the same time. Each version can have now up to 3 copies, and each of those copies will be identical SQL with perhaps different performance characteristics. Okay. The original way that we did this was plan management. We'll now call it plan management off, which says every time I rebind, and again, these features are only for rebind. This plan management feature is only for rebind. Every time I rebind, I will overlay the copy of the package that was out there before. Okay, so if we say run new statistics, and we think that's going to make everything better, and I rebind the packages to pick up the new statistics, but if I do it with plan management off, there's no way to get back to the way things used to be. Okay, so we're going to overlay the new access paths with the old, or overlay the old access paths with the new. Okay. So this is the way things were all the way up until version 9, right? It was the only thing we could do. The access paths may change, and I really don't have any easy way to go back. All right, so version 9 of DB2 introduced this plan management feature that had 2 additional options other than don't do it, right? The first one is basic. So if I rebind a package with plan management basic, what I'm asking for is for DB2 to produce, to rethink access paths and rethink all of the internal stuff that happens with a bind, with a rebind. We're going to produce a new copy of the package, but we're not going to overlay the current one or the one that was already out there. All right, so we're going to keep 2 copies of the package always, the new one we just produced and the previous one, what we're going to end up calling the previous one. If I do the rebind 3 times in a row, well, then it's very likely my current and my previous look exactly the same. Right, so we're just going to not overlay the new package or the old package with the new copy. So now whatever version of this package was, I now have 2 copies. Right, so again, a package can have multiple versions. Each version can have multiple copies. And you can see in the rebind command, we're specifying a version there. We tell it what version we are rebinding. If I say plan management basic, then we're going to keep 2 copies, the old and the new. That actually is not very frequently used. What's more commonly used now, and is the default beginning in version 10, is extended. Okay, so we're going to keep the same 2 that basic did, and we're also going to keep an additional 3rd copy of the package. So plan management extended, we're going to produce a new copy of the package. The old current copy of the package now becomes the previous, and we're also going to keep a 3rd copy that we'll call the original. So the original is kind of the oldest available copy, right? And it doesn't change with subsequent rebinds. All right, it doesn't change with subsequent rebinds. So if I rebind 3 times, my current and my previous are constantly getting overlaid, but the original stays the same. It's the oldest copy that we have once we started doing this, and that is usually going to be a result of the one from the actual bind, like when we actually changed the source code and compiled and did a bind. Okay. If there's no original when we do this the first time, the current gets copied to both previous and original. Okay. So it's possible, that we've been doing rebinds in the past with, say, plan management off. The first time I do it with plan management extended, I get the previous and original are both populated with the what was the old copy at that time. Okay. So this is going to get interesting when we start falling back to one of these other copies. We do have a catalog table now, syspack copy, which will track this for you. So that tells you where the previous and original copies are, if you have them, with what bind options were used on each of these. And this catalog table didn't come until version 10, even though the feature came in version 9. So one of the frustrations when it was first introduced was I have all these extra copies of the packages that I have no idea where they are or what they look like. So we got catalog support for it beginning in version 10. You can see the timestamps of when they were bound. There's a copy ID column on that table that tells you which one's the original, which one's the previous. So copy ID of 1 for previous, 2 for original. Okay. And you can see the bind options that were used and all that. It kind of looks like syspackage, only for the inactive copies. So when we execute, we're always running the current. Right? We're always going to be running the current copy. The previous and the original are there in case I need them, but they're never going to be executed as is. So if I would like to fall back to one of those, what I'm going to do is issue a rebind command with either switch previous, obviously make the previous copy back to the current, or switch original, make the original copy the current. I think the idea, by the way, of the original was, that if somebody rebinds like 8 or 9 times before, before we decide to try and go back to old access paths, we've got one that's kind of being held constant, right? That won't get overlaid by subsequent rebinds. Right, so that's the idea of the original, I believe. Okay, but we do have to think about, when I do these switches, what's happening with the 3 copies. So the first one is fairly straightforward. If I do a switch previous, the current becomes previous, the previous becomes current. Okay, and I don't lose anything. So you can flip-flop back and forth between the previous and the current. Right? If you're trying to figure out which one is better, you can try it each way and see how it goes, right? If I do a switch original, got to think about what that's going to look like. The original now becomes the current. Current becomes previous. Okay, and the original remains unchanged. So if I do a switch original now, 2 of the 3 copies are identical, right? The current and the original, because the original never changes. So I made the original the current. They're the same. What happened? The old current now becomes previous. What happened to the old previous? Well, I threw it away. Okay. So if you do a switch original, you do want to keep in mind that you are tossing one of the copies. And that may or may not be what you want, right? But the good news is we have, at least one of these copies that is, that is static and won't ever get thrown away. And that would be the original, okay? So just keep that in mind if you're using this to kind of control performance. If you do a switch original, you are losing one of the 3 copies. Okay, so things to think about, right? When a package goes invalid. So when do packages go invalid? Well, if you drop something that package is dependent on. For example, if I drop a table being used by some code, the package that contains a reference to that table gets marked as invalid. Well, now we have 3 copies of the package, right? So a lot of the time, all of those copies are going to get invalidated together. In other words, if you drop a package, you drop a table that's being used by a particular package, then it's a pretty sure thing that all the package copies are going to go invalid. If you drop an index, well, then only the copies of the package that actually use that index will be marked invalid. So let's say, when you did the original bind, it was using, you had a query using index 1, and then at some point you rebind with plan management extended, and it chooses index 2 instead of index 1. If we come back and drop index 1, only the original will go invalid, right? Because we're starting to use a different index now. All right, and that's all tracked in syspack copy. You don't want to switch to an invalid copy, probably. Okay. And there is actually a little bit of stuff in version 12 that addresses that, which we'll talk about in just a bit. Okay, switching to the original eliminates the previous copy. We talked about that. Right, please keep versions and copies distinct, right? Every version can have up to these 3 copies. When I start freeing things, if I free a package, the default is all the copies. So free package, you see I've got a location, collection ID, package name, and version. Each version can have up to 3 copies. Well, by default, I'm freeing them all. You can also say plan management scope inactive, meaning only free the previous and the original. So if I do a rebind, and this is one of the kind of not downside, but challenges of this plan management stuff is that it could actually triple the size of your DB2 directory, the biggest object in your catalog and directory where these packages live, called SPT01. All right, so cleaning up stuff that you're not using, well, your system programmers will thank you, right? So in other words, if I do a rebind and performance stays the same or gets better and stays that way for a while, it might be good to clean up these copies of the package that you're not using and probably will never use. So that would be free package plan management scope inactive. Right. Version 10 also threw another bind or rebind parameter out here called AP retain dupe no. This doesn't happen by default, but what it's saying here is I want plan management extended. In other words, keep all 3 copies. AP retain dupe no says, well, if the copies come out the same, in other words, the access path didn't change, right? If the access path after rebind is exactly the same as it was before, then don't bother keeping the extra copies. Right, so DB2 is tracking, what it used to be and what it is now. We'll see how that happens in just a minute. And don't keep the duplicates. Okay. Well, how does that even work, right? How does it know what the access path used to be? So beginning in DB2.10, or DB2.9, excuse me, they started internally storing in the package a copy of the plan table that was being produced by the access path selection. So you think about the plan table, right? When you do an explain, the way DB2 tells you about the access paths, what's happening, is with with the plan table, right? And if you look at documentation, you'll be able to see, okay, access type R means it's doing a table space scan, right? Access type I, it's using an index. Which index is it using? How many columns it's matching? All of that stuff is stored in a place called plan table. So in the past, DB2 would give that stuff to you if you asked for it, right? But it didn't really keep it anywhere if you didn't. Now, beginning in DB2.9, when you do a bind or rebind, DB2 keeps an internal copy of that plan table, even if you bind with explain no, right? Even if you say, no, don't give me the explain, DB2 doesn't give it to you externally, but it keeps it internally inside the package in a format that DB2 can read, but it's not really friendly for humans, okay? This happens at bind time or rebind time. But what this does is it allows the bind and rebind process to see in at a higher level what the access paths were. And that is how AP retain dupe works, right? If if you say AP retain dupe no, don't keep 3 copies unless they're different. Well, how did it know whether they were the same or different? It's just comparing these internal copies of the plan tables to the other copies and seeing if they're the same. Okay. So AP retain dupe no is one way you can also be friendly to your system people who have to, keep track of SPT01 and allocate space for it. It's become an unwieldy catalog or directory table space in the last few releases. Okay, and we can triple it just by starting to do plan management extended, which is now the default. But this fact that we're keeping this copy of the plan table internally now opens up a bunch of other possibilities that we can talk about. One of them is the explain package SQL statement. So explain package says, hey Db2, what are the access paths in this package right now? In the past, you could only really know this if you had done when you did the bind, you had done it with explain yes. So the problem with that is, well, let's say we do a rebind today and performance gets worse. And so we can do the explain on the statements as they exist today and see what the access paths are. But what might be really nice to know is, well, what were they yesterday, right? What was the access path for the queries when I did the bind originally? And the only way we could know that is if back when we did the bind originally, we had asked for the explain. So if that was like 3 years ago, right, we might have not even asked for the explain, or even if we did, have we kept the plan table around over those last 3 years so that I can go back and look at it? Even if we didn't, we can now do this explain package thing. Explain package, I give it a collection, package, version, and copy. And it will take that internal plan table that was generated at the time the bind happened and throw it out into my plan table. So even if I did the bind explain no originally, or I did the bind with explain yes, but I lost the plan table, I can reproduce it using this explain package. So this is not the access paths as they would exist if I bound today. This is the access paths that were generated at the time of the bind, whenever that was. Okay, this could be helpful for us. We'll see just how helpful maybe in a little bit. A sort of related feature is a bind option now called explain only. So we used to either say explain yes or explain no. As you're doing the bind, Db2, either give me the explain or don't give me the explain. Well, now I can say explain only, which is kind of like explain yes, but don't bind the package, right? So if I just want to know, hey, if I were to rebind this thing today, or if I were to bind it today, what would happen, right? What would the access paths be? So this generates the explain, the plan table stuff without actually producing a package. Right, so it might be interesting to do the explain package, see what the access paths are in the current package, do the explain only, see what they would be if I bound it today, and then you can have an idea of what's going to change, if anything's going to change, right? And then you should do some analysis maybe about whether those changes are a good or a bad thing. All right. So we have 2 other bind options that I would like to talk about in the little bit of time that we have left here, and that is APCOMPARE and AP reuse. The second one is much more popular than the first. So when we talk about stability, I wish I had more time to talk about this, but when we talk about stability, please keep in mind that stability is a double-edged sword. We're trying to prevent bad things from happening, right? That's stability. Along the way, we might also be preventing good things from happening, right? And so stability is a two-edged sword. If I force stability, I may be preventing bad things, but I also may be preventing good things. I think the idea, though, is that I don't usually have to attend meetings over the good things that happened, right? But when bad things happen, that sometimes causes us trouble. I seriously have never had anybody come to me when I was a DBA and say, hey, thank you for rebinding my package. It's running 10% faster than it used to. Right? The ones we hear about are the other ones. Right? So in trying to prevent bad things, we might also be preventing good things, and we need to think about that as we talk about these next few features. The first one is APCOMPARE. This came in version 10. It's good for both bind or rebind. And I have two new options. APCOMPARE none is obviously the way things always used to be. All right, APCOMPARE none says we're not doing any comparison. APCOMPARE warn says when we bind or rebind the package, please compare the access paths that are being produced now with what used to be there. And if things change, throw some warnings at me so that I know. APCOMPARE error says, please do the same thing, right? Compare the access paths that are being produced right now with what used to be there. And if they're different, please fail the bind or rebind. So in other words, I don't want things to change, right? Please just fail the bind. That's APCOMPARE. I have a hard time talking people into using this. The next one we're going to talk about, AP reuse, I find people using all the time. But this one is not as widely used, although I think I can think of some great uses for it. So for example, in your production, change control promotion, when you promote, new code to production and a bind has to happen, might be pretty cool to just say APCOMPARE warn on all your production binds, right? So, hey, if the access path changes when I promote code, why don't you just let me know, right? Throw a warning out of the bind, and that could be picked up by automation and generate a text message to someone or an email or something, right? Hey, when we start running this new code, the access paths are going to be different. That might be a good thing, right? That might improve performance, or it might be a bad thing, but it's going to be different. Okay. APCOMPARE error, obviously this is where I don't want the access path to change. And if it's going to change, please fail the bind. I can think of some uses for that one, perhaps when you migrate to a new release of DB2. And I want to rebind everything, or almost everything, but I also want to be careful about the things that would change access paths. So I'll say, rebind everything, APCOMPARE error. Let the things that aren't going to change get, packages bound on the release of DB2 that we're on. And then I have a list of other things that I need to look at. Okay. Again, this one's not real popular. It's one I like, but I have trouble talking people into using it. And here you see some outputs of the bind. One of the things you notice is that it doesn't give you a lot of information here, and the wording is a little bit weird. So apparently I had 4 statements in this package. I did a rebind, APCOMPARE error, and it says, okay, out of your 4 statements, 2 statements, the comparison was successful. Okay. That means the access paths were the same. And 2 of them, the comparison was unsuccessful, meaning the access paths were going to change. So that successful, unsuccessful is a little bit misleading to me. It just means, when we say successful, it means everything came out the same. Okay. So out of my 4 statements, 2 are going to stay the same, 2 are going to change, and therefore, because I said APCOMPARE error, we get the bind actually fails. Okay, so no new package is produced or no new copy of the package is produced. We just keep running what was out there before. Okay, that's a rebind with APCOMPARE error. I'm going back a slide here. Forgot to mention this, but for bind purposes, what are we comparing to? Because, well, with bind, we're actually producing a new version, usually, right? So what it's going to do is compare, well, if the version that you're binding is already out there, it'll compare to that. If you're producing a new version that's not already out there, it's going to compare to the most recent old version, right? The most recent version that's already out there. Okay. All right, so what do I do then? If I bound with APCOMPARE error, how do I figure out which two statements changed? Notice it didn't tell me anything about, which of the two statements were the same and which of the two changed. Well, probably the easiest way to deal with this is rebind the package with explain only. Then you'll get a plan table that has the new access paths. Run the explain package statement, and that will generate entries for the old access paths, and you can compare. If you do the bind with explain yes, you also do get some comments in the remarks column in the plan table. I think some people find those more helpful than others. This is what I tend to do, is just go back and actually generate all the access path stuff so that I can compare. Okay. APCOMPARE warn, most of this message looks the same. Right, this is really the same rebind I just did a minute ago. Two statements were successful, two were not successful, and I still got a good bind, right? So APCOMPARE warn is just throwing, hey, some of these access paths changed, have a nice day, right? We still do the bind though. You will get a condition code 4 out of the bind, and so maybe that's something that you trap and notify someone about. Okay. All right, so that's the one people don't use. Let's look at the one people do use. Access path reuse, AP reuse. This one has 3 options. Again, none being don't do this, right? Error or warn. Here's the terminology here is also a little confusing. The one I see used most often now, I see this one used after a migration. So let's say you migrate from DB211 to DB212. Right, and we'd like to rebind all of our packages because a package feels better in the EDM pool if it was bound on the current release. Right, there's actually some performance gain to be had there, even if the access paths don't change, just by having a package bound on the release it's running on. Right, so we want to rebind everything, but we're into stability. We like stability. We don't want things to change. So what I see people do is run rebinds on everything with AP reuse error. Now what that means is if the access path is going to change from what it used to be, I'm sorry, take that back. That's APCOMPARE. AP reuse says, please take the access path that used to be and try to make this rebind produce the same access path. And what actually happens under the covers here is that the plan table is extracted from the previous package. A little bit of comment in red there about how that's done. And it's passed into the bind process as a hint. So this is like hints that you don't have to code. Right, if you've ever dealt with access path hints before, they're sort of a pain on DB2, DB2ZOS especially. Hints are coming into play under the covers here, but you don't have to do anything about it. You just say AP reuse error. It's going to throw the old access paths out there as hints. So we could say we're trying to force the use of previous access paths when I rebind. Okay. It's not really forcing anything. We're going to try. And the error, where the error comes in that says, if that's not possible, if the hints are not accepted, then the bind fails. If the hints are not accepted, the bind fails. Okay, so don't let the access path change. That's what I'm doing there. Make it be the same, and if for whatever reason it can't make it be the same, then the bind fails. Okay. Why would it not be able to keep the access path the same? Well, why does a hint fail? There's a bunch of reasons that could happen. one of the main ones that happened between version 10 and version 11. So if you run AP reuse error and the last bind you have was from version 10, the optimizer, well, there was a lot of query rewrite that happened under the covers that began in version 11. So there's cases where it's trying to rewrite stage 2 non-indexable predicates as stage 1 indexable predicates. So a common example, if you have a where clause that says where year of a date equals 2017, right? That would be better written as date between January 1st, 2017 and December 31st, 2017. And DB2 actually, beginning in version 11, rewrites that for you. If that kind of thing happens, then the old access path may not even be usable anymore. In other words, the actual query was changed by query transformation, and it's not even the same query anymore. It produces the same answer, right? But if it's not the same query, then the same access path may not even be possible. And that's the kind of thing you'll see AP reuse error fail on, where the query was rewritten in a different way since the last bind. Okay. AP reuse warn was introduced in version 11. And I think what they were trying to address here is the situation where, let's say I have a package that has 50 SQL statements in it, and 49 of them are able to be reused from the previous copy, but one of them is not. So if I do AP reuse error there, then the whole bind is going to fail, right, for one statement. So AP reuse warn says, if one of them wants to change, or one of them is not able to be reused, right, we'll still take the hint or force the other 49 to use their old access paths. We will go ahead and let it generate a new access path for the one and throw a warning, but still let the bind work. Okay, so I think that was the main idea there, is we had lots of rebinds failing because one statement wanted to change, and therefore, all of the statements in the package could not be rebound. The other thing, there's a little side note on AP reuse warn. There are a couple of situations where the access path gets kind of unequivocally better, where AP reuse warn will just let it go. So for example, if you're using the same index as you used to be using, but you're matching more columns. So in other words, on version 10, I'm using index 1 matching 2 columns, but on version 11, I'm using index 1 matching 3 columns. If you rebind that with AP reuse warn, it will allow that change, okay? Because the thinking is, I think, that's kind of unequivocally good. There's really no way that could be bad. And not coincidentally, I think, that is something that happened a lot in version 11. Because of that predicate rewrite, DB2 is often able to use more columns in an index than it used to. Okay, so AP reuse warn will allow those kind of changes that are, I guess, always good. I try not to say always too much, but I think that is actually accurate in that case. Okay. All right, so if I'm doing AP reuse, for bind, the comparison will be with the version being bound if it already exists, or the most recent version available, right? It is possible that not every statement's going to match if you're doing a bind, right? So if you changed the SQL, and that's part of what you're doing as a bind, then it's going to look like a new statement to DB2. Right, and it will go through. It treats new statements as things that need to be bound. Okay. So AP reuse only applies to statements that are identical between the two versions. You don't need to have the same statement numbers like you did in access path hints, but it's actually hashing the text of the SQL, and it does have to be the same. Okay, so if you change the SQL, then it looks like a new statement. It's going to obviously get new access paths. Okay. So here's one, binding with AP reuse error. This is the same package I looked at before, where two of the statements wanted to change, right? If you remember going back to APCOMPARE, when I ran APCOMPARE on the same package, it said, okay, you got 4 statements. 2 of them wanted to change, 2 of them didn't. When I throw AP reuse at it, I say 4 of them were successfully reused, meaning I'm using exactly the same access paths as I was before the rebind. All right, so I got a successful rebind, and the performance characteristics of this package really shouldn't change. That's stability, right? That's what we apparently want, is stability. What I don't even know here, though, what it doesn't even tell me, is that 2 of them wanted to change. Right? If I were to rebind without AP reuse, 2 of these statements would take different access paths. And those changes might be good, and they might not be good. And I actually don't even know. Not only do I not know whether they would be good or not, but if I'm doing this kind of on a massive scale, I don't even know that they want to change. Right? Because AP reuse doesn't actually look at what it would do now. Right? It looks at only what it used to do, and it tries to force that. Okay. So force is such a harsh word. It's not really forcing anything. What it's doing is passing the old plan tables into the new bind as an optimization hint. All right. Sometimes this doesn't work if you have indexes that are no longer available, or a query rewrite across different DB2 versions or different maintenance made changes to the actual statement. Then obviously it will not be able to force the use of the old paths. Okay. All right, so a quick nod to some of the things that changed in DB2.12 related to this stuff. And keep in mind, DB2.12 also introduced a whole new set of these kinds of features for dynamic SQL, which we should look at in a future webinar. Number 1, we can free only the original or previous copies of a package, okay, or only invalid copies. So in 11 and prior, you could only just free the inactive ones, all of them, so both the previous and the original. Whether they were valid or not, you couldn't do them one by one. The switch, rebind with switch, will now not let you switch to an invalid copy of the package. Yeah, apparently people tried, apparently this worked on version 11 and prior, and, people did it and it was bad, right? So if one of the previous or the originals is marked as invalid and you try and switch to it, the bind with switch will actually fail, which I think is a good thing. Okay. AP reuse source option will allow you to reuse a hint, a reuse hint to be directed at either the previous or the original. So what you could do, if you want to switch to one of those invalid copies, is rather than do that, you could use it as the source for a reuse hint. Okay. And the DSN statement table now tells you if AP reuse was effective and which package was used as the source. Okay. So that's another kind of frustration. Remember, I said if you're doing a bind with AP reuse, it's either going to use the version of the package being overlaid or the most recent one that was already out there. DSN statement table now tells you which one that was. Okay. All right, a little bit of best practices, and then I think we're done. I find a lot of people, when you go to a new release of DB2, or if maintenance tells you to do rebinds and you actually do them, many people just rebind everything with AP reuse error. Okay. I think a more thorough approach that would allow for some good change to happen, if you're brave enough, right, be rebind everything using APCOMPARE error. Remember, APCOMPARE is the one that I like that nobody else uses. So what's going to happen then if I rebind, doing a mass rebind, APCOMPARE error? Well, some of them are going to work and some of them are going to fail. The ones that work are the ones where the access path wasn't going to change anyway, right? The ones that fail are the ones now where the access path does want to change. But now I have a list of packages where the access path wants to change. and I can go do some analysis, right? I can take the failing packages and now do a rebind with explain only. It says, well, what would these access paths be? And analyze the differences. Okay, you could also then, if you really wanted a rebind of everything right now, take that list of failures and rebind them AP reuse error, right? Or AP reuse warn, either one. So in other words, they'll get bound and their access paths won't change, but I at least know which ones want to change, okay? So that I can do some analysis and at least know what was going to change, and then try and decide whether those are good changes or bad changes. I do fear that in kind of with stability being the most important thing on everybody's mind, that not only do we prevent bad things from happening, but we also prevent good things from happening. AP reuse warn, again, I think that is that's a good thing to do if you're doing, as opposed to AP reuse error, so that you're not failing binds just for when one statement can't be reused. Okay. In your regular change control, you want plan management extended, which is now the default, possibly with AP retain dupe no, which is not the default. Again, extended says keep the 3 copies. AP retain dupe no says only keep them if they're actually different. AP compare warn or maybe error on your production binds. Right, so that's just for when we change the code in the normal change control process. If something changes, maybe we'd like to know before it starts running and causes problems. Okay. So those are just some thoughts that I have on these new features. Hopefully this has been helpful for you. Again, at the Themis website, you can download the slides from today's presentation. Again, go to www.themisinc.com and click on the webinars tab at the top. You'll see this and a bunch of other webinars out there where you can grab the slides and look at replays of old ones and sign up for new ones. The replay of this webinar will be out there within a day or two, and you can share it with your friends if you think it would be helpful for them. We'll probably come back in a few months maybe and do a follow up on this where we talk about the version 12 stuff that impacts more on dynamic SQL. I do have, I see one question out there that says, can we get a copy of the presentation? Again, at themisinc.com/webinars or themisinc.com and click the webinars tab. You should be able to download a copy of the presentation out there. Okay. Hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Feel free to email me with questions or comments, and look forward to seeing you at another one of these going forward. Have a good rest of your day.